Welcome to my video on the miscellaneous vehicles of Fallout. I have previously covered the cars of Fallout that looked strictly at cars and pickup trucks, but did not cover other vehicles such as buses, motorcycles, semi-trucks, and the like. Also remember to check out the end of the video where I have special mentions and corrections based on the comments from my previous video. So there really isn't much else to do it than to jump right into it. Fallout 1 and 2 have the same vehicles, with only the Highwaymen that I covered in another one of my early videos being a notable exception. So let's start with the motorcycle, which, well, as you can see, there's not a lot to go off of. If I zoom in a bit, there we go. We can see that that didn't help at all. We can vaguely tell that it is a cruiser type of motorcycle, with what appears to be a passenger backrest, otherwise known as a sissy bar. It is really hard to tell any other defining feature that may help us identify a real-world analog, so we are just going to have to live with the pixelated ambiguity. A special encounter will show the player a turned-over Nuka-Cola truck that has seen better days. It was supposedly crashed by a ghoul named Lumpy a long time ago, who you can meet in the game by running him over. It can yield a lot of bottle caps depending on the player's luck, and if they have the Fortune Finder perk. It appears to be a box truck since there are only 2 axles, rather than the multiple axles one would find with a transport truck designed to haul trailers. It is really hard to gather any more meaningful information about this truck, because we cannot see any defining features of the cab. The so-called tank truck is called that because it's a truck with a giant tank on the back. Look, I don't come up with the names around here, so don't complain to me about the unoriginal names. The large smokestacks and 3 axles denote a large diesel truck, which is substantiated by the in-game description that states that this old diesel truck is far beyond any help. The design is interesting, with very small windows that would have heavily restricted the driver's vision. 2 rectangle-shaped lights that sit atop the large fender flares, and what appears to be a double bumper. Truthfully, this truck looks like it would fit right in with Mad Max, and I could not find a similar real-world truck. The rectangular lights on the wheel flares, the very short windows and windshield, the double bumper, and really low hood make it unlike anything similar in our world. The transport truck is the best chance we have of identifying a non-car vehicle in the original Fallout. It is also the most complete, even bearing the old signage on the bed trailer. It pulls strongly from truck designs from the 1940s and a bit from the 1950s, like this International Harvester truck from the 40s. The grille with large slats, the large fenders where the lights are installed, are all very reminiscent of this style, although there are no clear matches. The 4 circular headlights was implemented in some 50s and 60s trucks, like the 59 Ford F100. Some believe that the Nuka-Cola truck we spoke of earlier is the same truck, just branded for Nuka-Cola instead of Jay's Moving. While this isn't impossible, how about that for a double negative? It is clear that this moving truck has a double rear axle, while the Nuka-Cola truck has only 1 rear axle. It also isn't clear who Jay was, or what he was moving, but he definitely got around since all the cargo-type trucks in the game belong to him. Okay, this one's a stretch, but by the definition of a vehicle, it counts, so I'm including it. If you disagree, be sure to write me a long, lengthy, and in-depth comment why you disagree, and I'll be sure to ignore it. The Brahmin Cart is a collection of car trunks and truck beds that have been detached from the cab of various vehicles and refitted to be hitched to Brahmin and hauled around the wasteland. These carts include 3 different cars and 1 truck, with all the cars having taillights, fins, and other designs reminiscent of 50s and 60s cars. The truck bed does not look like any design from the 50s and instead is more like designs from the 60s that have larger taillights. What I find so interesting is that there seem to be more car halves than truck halves in the wasteland, which is peculiar simply because of the extra effort involved with separating the back half of a car versus a truck. While it's certainly possible to cut a car in two, and if the demands necessitate it, it can indeed be done. But the extra effort that would be required in cutting a car in two would be a lot more than a truck. This would seem to indicate that there was a higher proportion of cars to trucks in the Fallout world. Fallout Tactics had a vehicle that would only be encountered if you pre-ordered the game, and it is the Buggy. This car looks straight out of Mad Max and was apparently put together using odds and ends by a group of drunk raiders. It is supposed to be quick and lightly armored, but the raiders thought it was important enough to add a pilot, otherwise known as a cowcatcher, that many old trains had. This thing looks like a sandrail or a kind of side-by-side vehicle that we are used to seeing in more modern times. A cut vehicle from Tactics was the bus, which was only ever used for promotional purposes. I have to say, this thing honestly looks like one of those VB IEDs or suicide trucks that ISIS was known for constructing. It looks like an up-armored school bus whose engine has been modified, and, of course, a large pilot, aka cowcatcher, bolted to the front because apparently nothing in the Chicago wasteland needed much clearance. The City Liner is a large bus that can be found in Fallout 3 and New Vegas. This bus can be found intact, which the player cannot open up and get inside of, or they are often found with the rear portion of the bus missing. The number of buses missing the back portion is somewhat baffling, since it is not terribly uncommon. Hey, maybe that's where all these Brahmin Carts are coming from. They are all nuclear powered, which is indicated by warnings on the side of the bus that read, "Warning, exhaust," and "Warning, radiation." It also has two front axles, which is interesting and probably has two rear axles as well, although the rear portion is covered up by some large things that are labeled as not being a step. This bus is very unique looking, due to the two front axles and multi-panel windshield that protrudes a little bit from the bus. However, I see a vague resemblance with the 1960s era silver bullet buses that were very commonly used by Greyhound. Some interesting things about this bus are that it is the second largest vehicle explosion in the game, only behind a vertibird, and is equivalent to around 3 mini-nukes. Players can also climb up the back, specifically where the signs "No Step" are printed, allowing the player to climb up and on top of the bus with some invisible steps. The motorcycle from Fallout 3 is only found in one design, pictured here. It is a cruiser design that is quite bulky looking. The sheer size of the motorcycle makes it look more like a touring type of cruiser, evidenced by the containers on the side and rear, as well as some racks that are mounted over the rear wheel. The sheer bulk of the design makes it look more like modern touring motorcycles than anything vintage, and the headlamp design is also very strange. It has dual exhaust, and probably had to have a decent size engine for the size of the bike. It isn't clear what the power source is, although it seems like it may have been gas or at least used some sort of internal combustion engine, since it explodes without giving off radiation, and the explosion is one of the smallest in the game, dwarfed even by grenades or mines. The mounting of the exhaust also looks to almost be at the very bottom of the back wheel, which would not be great for clearance, which is a pretty common thing with Fallout vehicles for some reason. The so-called truck in Fallout 3 and New Vegas is the first true semi-truck that we take a look at in this video. Other than fairly small windows again, it looks pretty standard, until you look at the rear portion of the vehicle. There's a large cylindrical portion with radiating slats of metal that looks an awful lot like cooling slats. Then we see the trailer mount with the double rear axle that is not too dissimilar to 18-wheelers that we are used to seeing. The overall design looks the most like the 1950s GMC Cannonball tractor truck, with the cylindrical portion in the rear being a notable exception. I believe that the cylindrical portion in the back is part of the nuclear-powered engine, and is likely a key cooling area, although being directly behind the cab and in front of the trailer would restrict incoming air if it was reliant on air cooling, which the slats seem to suggest. The truck has the third largest vehicle explosion in the game, right behind the bus. The Street Cleaner is quite a unique looking vehicle and can be found in the Capital Wasteland as well as the Mojave. Rather than being something we would recognize as a street cleaner, it is essentially just a giant vacuum that can be driven around and suck up trash and probably some small animals too. Almost all examples going back to horse-drawn carriage street cleaners all use a sweeping device alone or in conjunction with a vacuum to clean up that Nuka bottle that you so carelessly threw onto the ground. Obviously, I was not able to find any real street cleaner that looks anything like this, but it definitely seems to take some visual cues from handheld vacuums from the early 20th century, like the 1926 Hoover handheld vacuum. These can be blown up but have an explosion similar to the motorcycle, which is one of the weakest explosions in the game. The fire truck in Fallout New Vegas makes an appearance, and looking at the vehicle, it is obvious that they reused the truck from Fallout 3, so the front visually looks like the GMC Cannonball. However, it was painted red and given all the bells and whistles that we come to expect from fire trucks. There is nothing else that hints towards anything other than generic fire truck trappings. Fire trucks found in the Lonesome Road DLC are all marked as being from Searchlight, which has a fire station that the player can explore. The golf cart is another vehicle that can be found in Fallout New Vegas. And to be honest, when I saw these in Fallout New Vegas, I had no idea that they were supposed to be golf carts. Many have canopies, and while the design itself is different, the thing that really stands out is that they have 3 wheels instead of 4. I have seen some of the shenanigans people do in golf carts, and can't help but think how unstable these would be, especially with how some of the people I know drive them. It was actually not uncommon for older golf cart models to have 3 wheels, as it likely made turning easier since there is no power steering on these guys, as well as much simpler to produce. Now, I know I can't always find great examples for some of the things in my videos, but I hope you all know that I certainly do try. That said, my wizardry was able to come up with a pretty good fit given the odd look of the cart. The Cushman 735 Golfster is a pretty close fit and probably the artist's basis for the creation of this golf cart. The bus in Fallout 4 does not have a name like the City Liner in Fallout 3. However, it is similar enough that I would say it is an iteration of the City Liner model. This bus design also appears in Fallout 76. It has the same double front axle, multi-panel windshield, and large wheel cover things that cover the bus's back wheels. It lacks some of the unique elements of the City Liner, like the ability to climb up the back, and won't even ignite or explode when damaged. What that means exactly, I don't know, as one can infer that they are no longer nuclear powered and perhaps powered by benign batteries, or maybe it has superior shielding that makes it nigh impossible to damage enough to cause catastrophic failure. The inspiration is likely also the same bus, being the 1960s Silver Bullet buses. Different variants can be found. Some are very obviously school buses, and others operated as shuttles at Nuka World with Nuka-Cola emblazoned on the side. The van of Fallout 4 and 76 is pretty cool, as it has obvious retro leanings, but has some interesting additions that we haven't seen in cars until more recently. The cab has multiple glass panels in the ceiling, giving the van a kind of bubble canopy look. The front end of the van looks a lot like the station wagon I covered in a previous video, so the inspiration is the same as the station wagon, which is the 1950s Studebaker Coupe. Now what is interesting is that it doesn't look anything like the old Studebaker vans, but it also doesn't have rear tail lights like anything from the Studebaker vehicles that are the obvious inspirations. The rear taillights look a lot like the 1960s era Cadillac Fleetwood, with the stacked taillights and long conical light shape, while the same circular ornamentation that is found on the front is also on the back. Maybe I'm mistaken on that part, and the circular object is actually functional, but I'm not entirely sure. These are found all over the Commonwealth, and the Vault Tech rep at the very beginning rolls up in one of these babies before talking to you during the intro sequence. Fallout 4 and 76's motorcycle is given the name Lone Wanderer, and was sold as early as 2072 and marketed as an escape for middle-class Americans, with the slogan, "Leave work behind." Now, the naming of this motorcycle and the protagonist's name in Fallout 3 can't be happenstance. However, I don't know what significance, if any, this seems to have. This is a cruiser-type motorcycle, and is a lot more conventional looking than the motorcycle from Fallout 3 that was incredibly bulky. Another key difference between this motorcycle and Fallout 3's is that there is no visible exhaust system, and looking at the rear of the bike, we see what appears to be a nozzle of some sort with porting. It is unclear if this is part of the exhaust system, or if this maybe even provided thrust, but was definitely functional as we see some piping lead from the engine area to the rear of the bike. If those pipes were at all hot, which is very likely, those would be some serious hazards, given how close they are to the rider's legs, and how there is no shielding. Looking at possible inspirations, I think the design of the 1950s era Indian Chief Blackhawk is a great candidate when looking at the front and rear wheel flares. It also has the general look, although the Lone Wanderer bike has a lot more going on under the seat, and was likely considerably heavier. It also has a small protrusion under the headlamp which looks like it is integrated with the body of the bike. This could present a problem, as it would limit how much you could turn the front tire before the suspension would hit it. I could not remember and can't check in-game whether or not these can be blown up when damaged, so someone test it and get back to me on that. The truck of Fallout 4 and 76 is much like the bus in that it looks remarkably similar to the Fallout 3 version, with just some small aesthetic differences. That said, I still think the closest inspiration is the GMC Cannonball. The Fallout version just has some minor differences and additions, like lights and ornamentations. They are found in numerous colors and pulling various trailers and other large pieces of machinery. The Wicked Shipping branded trucks can be opened and the contents looted, which is a nice change from the static trailers of previous Fallouts that we couldn't get into if they were closed. Fallout 76 introduces the first dirt bike that we have seen in the series, and is something that I felt like should not only be common throughout the wasteland, but at a certain point, be an option for transportation. Not to get too off topic, but a roving band of bloodthirsty warriors that have been able to revitalize and use old world dirt bikes to implement hit and run tactics would parallel Genghis Khan's horde and might introduce a cool new mechanic and faction. And I know, there's already a Great Khan faction, but they are basically a bunch of drug-addled nobodies by the end of Fallout New Vegas. Looking at the dirt bike, we can see some interesting things. Firstly, it has the same type of exhaust system, if we want to call it that, as the Lone Wanderer, even with the same little thruster type thing on the back. It is also pretty obvious that the tires on the dirt bike are comically small, and not only are they small, but they have absolutely no tread, and they look a lot more like street tires. I see no pegs for the riders to rest their feet, and obviously no gear shifter that would be located near or on the pegs. Though, to be fair, if this is electric, then no gears would be necessary. Lastly, I see nothing in the way of suspension, no struts or springs of any kind. It looks like a solid frame suspension, which would, how do I say this nicely, absolutely freaking suck off or on road. Perhaps we could say that the parts have been stripped for other uses, or street tires had to be put on because no one could salvage any more off-road tires. While that may be, Fallout 76 doesn't take place too long after the Great War, and every single dirt bike looks like this, so I don't really even know what to make of this. The so-called off-road vehicle makes an appearance in Fallout 76, and looks like what the average person might think of when asked to think of an off-road vehicle. The boxy look, large tires, open cab, and spare tire on the back are very reminiscent of the 1941 Ford GP, just with the headlights installed on the flares rather than the grille area. While it can't be interacted with, like with all of Fallout's vehicles, some are found with free state markings on them, meaning that up until fairly recently, they were actually working and being used. The shuttle bus found in the wastes of West Virginia come in many colors. There's not really much of a particular note with this vehicle, other than when it explodes, it destroys the front of the vehicle and leaves the back relatively unharmed. It looks very similar to the KAVZ series of buses that were common in the 70s and 80s throughout the Soviet Union. Yes, that Soviet Union. The only other things I have found with Soviet design similarities have been some of the weapons, so it is cool to have a close simile from across the pond. The dump truck of Fallout 76 is yet another example of all the trucks in Fallout, after Fallout Tactics, having the same DNA. The dump truck is the same as all the other trucks, just with, wait for it, a dump truck bed. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but again the inspiration is the GMC Cannonball. Many of these can be found in West Virginia due to the heavy mining industries and can be a good source of loot if found. The fire truck in Fallout 76 is not just a reskin of the same truck. Thank Adam. A quite original design is seen on 8 wheels and makes for a pretty massive fire truck. I suspect such large fire trucks were needed due to the nature of a lot of the extraction industries present in the area. This vehicle is also unique in that the closest design is the MAZ-7310, which is another Soviet-designed vehicle, this one introduced in the early 70s. The similarities are very apparent, and I want to know what inspired the devs in Fallout 76 to be looking at 70s Soviet designs for some of the game's unique vehicles. I think it is fun to think of some of the implications of the presence of foreign designed game elements and what that means for Fallout's alternate timeline. Does the presence of these Soviet designs hint toward a more amicable relationship between the traditionally opposing Cold War powers? Who knows for sure? Bikes can be found in Fallout 76 and appear to be standard cruiser bicycles. That is such a common design, it would not be possible to list all the different makes and models. It comes in all sorts of colors and even has a variant adorned with human bones, because it's the apocalypse and what else are you going to do? There's a small passive encounter which shows what appears to be a 3-way collision that ended up destroying the bikes and killing the 3 riders. This is one of my favorite aspects of these games. These small unmarked things that just leave you laughing and wondering what led to this ridiculous scenario. Golf carts can again be found in Fallout 76, but they look different this go around. They look a bit like another Cushman model, the 56 electric golf cart, although it is not a one-for-one relationship. Fallout 76 acknowledges mankind's weird and destructive relationship with golf carts, and shows many instances where riders crashed them into each other, wrecked into stationary objects, sometimes killing the driver, and even jousting. Although I have to admit, the jousting does sound pretty fun. That does it for the miscellaneous vehicles of Fallout. I know that this is not every single other vehicle in the Fallout series that has not been previously covered, and that's for a good reason. There are enough vehicles left over to make a heavy machinery of Fallout video that will feature tractors and other machinery from the series, especially Fallout 76. I am also contemplating how best to keep up to date with new game releases. New cars and planes have been added in Fallout 76 since I made those videos last. However, there haven't been enough additions to constitute standalone videos. Perhaps I will make videos centered on future games, and combine boats, vehicles, and planes into one video as new games come out. But let's get real. we aren't going to see a new Fallout game for probably at least 5 years, so we've got time. Now onto the comments and highlights of my previous video about Fallout and Fallout 2 inspired protagonists. Given the subjective nature of the video, I had many comments that were permutations of the same thing. Many asked why some people like Elder Maxon were not mentioned in the video, and some that I did, like Caesar, did make it in the video. I left comments as to my reasoning, but wanted to make a note here as well since not everyone is reading the comments. One could argue a different antagonist based on who they decide to side with and end the game with in Fallout 4 and Fallout New Vegas. I always felt like the Institute, and therefore the leadership of the Institute, to be the impetus that drives all conflict in the game. Without the Institute, the Railroad would not even exist. The Brotherhood would not have strong motivations to move into the area with the massive force that they did, and the surface would likely be a lot more unified, since the Institute actively sabotages any effort to unify and show strength. The Institute is even the reason for the main player to take the journey that he does, and it stands to reason that without the Institute, none of the events, other than maybe the Brotherhood projecting some power in the region at some point in time, would occur. In the case of Caesar, I see the Legion as being in a similar position, where their absence would seriously impact the events that may or may not happen in the game, to the point where the game would be just unrecognizable. The Legion presents a good enough foil and threat to the NCR to keep them from just taking everything in the region and continuing west, giving House the moment he needs to be able to strike out and execute his plans for ruling Vegas. Although, I will admit that this is a stretch when looking at the strict definition of what antagonists are. There were many comments complaining about Bethesda and their writing style, especially when it came to antagonists or controversial material. I am definitely willing to acknowledge weaknesses in Bethesda's approach to games, but don't think it is always so clear-cut, as there are moments of really great writing as well. I am thinking of making a future video to better elucidate my thoughts, but I find myself fairly conflicted on the matter, so it would take some time. Many of you lamented the fact that I failed to mention certain characters like Father Elijah and Ulysses. I purposely left some of these characters out, since their presence being confined to DLCs, with some in-game mentions and Easter eggs, was a slightly different situation. However, I think both of them had enough of the characteristics I mentioned in the video that I really should have taken the time to talk about them, and pushed that 30-minute video even longer. That's it for these highlights. Thanks as always for taking the time to watch my content and leave me comments. Please keep it up. I wish you all the best until next time, and may you all walk in Adam's glow.